For 27 years, a single man lived in absolute, suffocating isolation in the freezing woods of Maine, without lighting a fire, without having a conversation, and without a single promise that he would ever rejoin the human race. Walking into the forest in 1986, he survived sub-zero winters, the gnawing threat of starvation, and the crushing, profound silence of being utterly alone. As the Berlin Wall fell, as the internet was born, as the world sped up into a deafening blur of noise and technology, he sat perfectly still beneath the pine trees. This is a true story, not about surviving a shipwreck or a plane crash, but about a terrifying, voluntary exile. It is about what happens to the human mind when it decides to completely erase itself from the world. His name was Christopher Knight. When he finally emerged from the trees in 2013, he had not spoken a single word aloud in over a quarter of a century. He did not know what a smartphone was. What he knew, with chilling clarity, was how to vanish. In the summer of 1986, Christopher Knight was a 20-year-old with a good job, a loving family, and a brand-new car. There was no trauma. There was no criminal record. There was no religious awakening. He simply drove his car up a dirt road in rural Maine, parked it, left the keys on the dashboard, and walked into the dense, dark tree line. He had no map. He had no compass. He had no plan. He walked south, guided only by an overwhelming, primal urge to get away from the noise of humanity. He hiked through the dense, tangled underbrush until the sound of highways faded entirely, replaced by the snapping of twigs and the distant call of loons. Eventually, he found a patch of woods in the Belgrade Lakes region. It was a patch of forest so rocky, dense, and uneven that no hikers or hunters ever bothered to walk through it. Here, nestled tightly between massive, glacial boulders, he decided to stop. He would not leave this tiny, hidden enclave for the next 27 years. But Christopher Knight was not a survivalist. He did not know how to hunt, he did not know how to forage, and he had no wilderness training. The forest did not welcome him, it tested him. He stumbled upon a small, natural fortress, a cluster of massive, glacial boulders hidden within an impenetrable thicket. Here, he built a camp that was a masterpiece of camouflage. He dragged stolen, forest-green tarps across the canopy, weaving them through the branches to create an artificial sky. It blocked out the sun, completely hiding his tent from passing aircraft and hunters. He suspended his tent slightly off the ground to prevent his footsteps from wearing a path in the dirt. But Maine winters are not just cold, they are a violent physical assault. The temperature regularly plummets to 20 degrees below zero. The air becomes so brittle that the sap inside the pine trees freezes and cracks with a sound like a rifle shot. Knight knew that lighting a fire meant discovery. Smoke can be smelled for miles. Smoke brings people, so for 27 years he lived in perpetual freezing darkness. To survive the lethal winter nights, he engineered a desperate, terrifying routine. He bundled himself in multiple stolen sleeping bags, layering them perfectly to trap his body heat. But he knew that if he slept too deep, the cold would stop his heart, and he would never wake up. He trained his mind to snap awake at 2 in the morning, the absolute coldest hour of the night. With his breath freezing into ice crystals on his beard, he would force himself out of his sleeping bag. He would stand up and pace the tiny 10-foot perimeter of his camp, back and forth, hour after hour, in the pitch black. He walked just to keep his blood moving, fighting off hypothermia through sheer, agonizing willpower until the sun finally broke through the trees. But willpower cannot stop starvation. To eat, Knight had to become a phantom. He became the most prolific, undetected burglar in the history of Maine. Committing over 1,000 break-ins, he fed off the edges of civilization without ever being seen. Under the cover of heavy rain or pitch-black, moonless nights, when nobody in their right mind would be outside, he would glide through the forest toward the summer cabins surrounding North Pond. This wasn't simple theft, it was a high-stakes, covert operation. He memorized the terrain so perfectly that he knew exactly where to step on exposed tree roots and moss-covered stones to avoid leaving a single footprint in the mud. He wore a stolen watch to time his movements perfectly. He watched the cabins from the tree line for hours, tracking the residents' patterns. When a cabin was empty, he approached. He picked locks with masterful surgical skill. He would slip inside, standing in the dark kitchens of strangers, and take only what was necessary for his survival: propane tanks, heavy batteries, peanut butter, processed foods that wouldn't spoil, and paperback books to quiet his mind. He never stole jewelry, he never stole money. He took only what kept him alive. For decades, the residents of North Pond were haunted by this invisible presence. They called him the Hermit of North Pond. It was an eerie, psychological terror for the homeowners. They would find a window slightly unlatched, or notice a missing flashlight, or see that exactly 2 steaks were gone from the freezer. They left notes for him on their tables, pleading with him to stop, or offering to leave bags of food outside if he would just stay out of their homes. They installed heavy deadbolts, motion sensor lights, and expensive alarm systems. But Knight studied their security, bypassed their locks, and vanished back into the trees like smoke, leaving behind nothing but the crushing silence of his boulder fortress. But the physical survival was nothing compared to the terrifying psychological metamorphosis occurring inside his mind. Extreme isolation irreparably alters the chemistry of the brain. For 27 years, Christopher Knight did not look in a mirror. He did not hear his own voice. Without another human being to interact with, without society to reflect his personality back to him, his sense of self began to dissolve. He didn't talk to himself. He didn't keep a journal. He later confessed that in the total, crushing silence of the woods, his ego simply vanished. He stopped defining himself as a man or even as a human. He lost track of his age. He felt he had merged completely with the pine trees and the snow. He became part of the landscape, just another silent creature watching the seasons change, completely detached from the anxieties, ambitions, and judgments of the human race. But a phantom cannot run forever. While Knight was sitting perfectly still, the world outside was accelerating. The technology to catch him was getting cheaper, and the local authorities were getting desperate. The turning point came at the Pine Tree Camp, a summer retreat for people with disabilities located along the lake. It was a massive facility with a fully stocked commercial pantry. For Knight, it was a reliable lifeline. But for game warden Terry Hughes, it was the perfect place for a trap. Hughes had been hunting the Hermit of North Pond for years. He was tired of the ghost stories. In the spring of 2013, Hughes rigged the camp with a military-grade security system. He placed invisible motion sensors along the tree line and hid a silent alarm system connected directly to his own bedroom. Then he waited. On the night of April 4, 2013, the forest was dead quiet. Knight emerged from the shadows. He moved with his usual terrifying precision, slipping through the woods and effortlessly picking the lock on the camp's dining hall door. He stepped into the dark, silent kitchen. The smell of processed food and stale air filled his lungs. He began filling his backpack with the precise items he needed: marshmallows, coffee, heavy sleeping bags. He didn't know that the moment his foot crossed the threshold, a silent signal had been beamed miles away. Terry Hughes jolted awake in his bed. The alarm was flashing. Minutes later, as Knight was standing in the pitch-black pantry, the absolute silence of his 27-year isolation was violently shattered. A blinding, explosive beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the darkness, hitting Knight squarely in the face. He was instantly blinded. Then came the sound. A human voice, roaring with adrenaline, echoed off the kitchen walls. "Get on the ground, do it now." Knight froze. His mind, conditioned to the slow, quiet rhythms of the forest, couldn't process the sudden violence of the modern world. He didn't run. He didn't fight. The phantom simply surrendered. He slowly placed his stolen food on the counter, lowered his knees to the cold linoleum floor, and put his hands behind his back. As the officers handcuffed him, they asked him a simple question: "What is your name?" Silence hung in the air. Knight opened his mouth, but the vocal cords that had lain dormant for over a quarter of a century refused to work. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with the shock of human contact, struggling to remember the concept of identity. Finally, with a voice that cracked and rasped like dry leaves, he whispered a word he hadn't heard since 1986. "Christopher." Knight froze. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He slowly placed the food on the counter and lowered himself to the floor. When the police officer asked him his name, it took Knight several long, agonizing seconds to force his vocal cords to work. He whispered, "Christopher." The arrest of the North Pond hermit became a global media sensation overnight. Journalists from around the world flocked to the rural Maine jail. The public was obsessed. People sent him marriage proposals. They sent him money. They wanted to know why he did it. They desperately wanted the secret to life. Some that a man who had meditated in the silent woods for nearly 3 decades had unlocked some profound, spiritual wisdom about the universe. But Christopher Knight had no profound wisdom to give them. He had no grand manifesto. For Knight, returning to civilization was an agonizing physical trauma. After 27 years of listening to the wind and watching the moon cycle, he was thrust into a county jail. The sensory overload was absolute torture. The harsh, buzzing hum of fluorescent lights that never turned off burned his eyes. The stinging chemical smell of bleach and concrete filled his lungs. The constant, echoing slamming of heavy metal doors and the chaotic, angry shouting of inmates felt like a physical assault on his brain. He sat in the corner of his cell, rocking back and forth, mourning the loss of his trees. He had survived the deadliest winters in nature, but society was breaking him in days. When a journalist finally sat across from him, separated by thick glass, and asked the question everyone was wondering, why did he leave? Knight struggled to answer. His voice was still weak, rusty from disuse. He finally explained that he found the modern world to be a suffocating, unnatural machine. It was too loud. It was too fast. It demanded too much. He looked at the journalist and said, "I did not go into the woods to find myself. I went into the woods to lose myself." He explained that solitude did not grant him a sharper identity. It erased his identity completely. In the absolute quiet, he achieved a state of pure, detached existence that most monks only dream of. Christopher Knight was sentenced to serve 7 months in jail, but his true punishment began upon his release. He was sentenced to the very thing he had sacrificed his entire life to escape: modern society. He was forced to move back into the real world. He was forced to get a job. He had to learn how to use the internet, how to pay taxes, and how to navigate a world where everyone was constantly staring at glowing screens in their hands. The man who had moved through the forest like a ghost was now trapped in the deafening, inescapable noise of the 21st century. The story of Christopher Knight forces us to look in the mirror and ask a deeply uncomfortable question. We view extreme isolation as a symptom of madness. We believe that to be a healthy human is to be constantly connected, constantly speaking, sharing, posting, and consuming. But to Christopher Knight, society was the madness. We are moving at a terrifying speed, surrounded by so much artificial noise that we have completely forgotten how to sit still. He didn't need our world. He didn't want our money or our attention. He only wanted the peace of his own silent universe. It leaves us with a haunting reflection. In our desperate, daily rush to be seen and heard by everyone, what parts of our own minds have we drowned out? If this story made you question the noise in your own life, please hit the like button. It really helps these documentaries reach more people. And subscribe for more deep dives into the extraordinary limits of the human mind. Thanks for watching.